Every house on Maple Street knew the story. Eddie Morrison, the mailman who'd walked their route for 15 years, simply vanished one October morning in 1989. His truck found empty, his uniform never recovered, but nobody thought to look beneath Mrs. Henderson's prize roses. Before I tell you how this impossible story unfolds, I need to know, where are you right now? Are you listening to this on your way to work? Maybe you're at home with the lights dimmed? Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from, because stories like this bring our community together, and I absolutely love hearing from each and every one of you. Sarah Johnson had heard the tale 3 times during her first week as the new owner of 1247 Maple Street. Once from the grocery store clerk, once from her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, and once from the pizza delivery guy who seemed genuinely spooked by the address. "That's the Henderson house," he'd said, clutching the insulated bag tighter. "Lady who lived there before you?" She knew something about that mailman. Always got real quiet when anyone brought up Eddie Morrison. Sarah had laughed it off. Small towns love their mysteries, especially the unsolved kind. But as she stood in her backyard that crisp October morning, exactly 34 years after Eddie's disappearance, her shovel grinding against something metallic beneath the soil, she wasn't laughing anymore. The house itself had drawn Sarah in from the moment she'd seen the listing online. A 1950s colonial with original hardwood floors, updated Kit Johnson, and what the realtor called mature landscaping. The photos had shown glimpses of an elaborate garden, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of Ethel Henderson's botanical masterpiece. The roses had been magnificent when she'd first toured the property. Deep red blooms the size of dinner plates, their stems thick as her thumb, roots that seemed to have claimed every inch of the garden bed. The real estate agent had gushed about them, clearly using them as a selling point for the otherwise modest home. "Ethel Henderson planted these in 1955, she'd said, running her manicured fingers along a particularly impressive bloom. "Won the county garden show 12 years running. Even after she got sick, they kept blooming like nothing could stop them. The soil here must be incredibly rich." What the agent hadn't mentioned was how Ethel had died alone in 2023, her body undiscovered for 2 weeks until the mail carrier, Eddie Morrison's replacement, had noticed the smell, or how the neighbors whispered about the strange sounds that came from her yard on quiet nights, or how she'd never once allowed anyone to help with her gardening, despite being nearly 90 years old and clearly struggling with the physical demands. Mrs. Patterson had filled in some of these details during their first conversation over the fence. The elderly woman had moved in next door only 2 years ago, inheriting the house from her Aunt Ethel, and she seemed eager to share the neighborhood's history. Aunt Ethel was particular about her garden, Mrs. Patterson had said, her voice carrying a note of fondness mixed with something else Sarah couldn't quite identify. She'd be out there at dawn, working in the soil with her bare hands. Said it was therapeutic. Said the earth told her what it needed. Sarah's landscaping project had started innocently enough. She was a software developer who worked from home, and she'd always dreamed of growing her own food. The roses were beautiful, but she wanted vegetables. Tomatoes, herbs, maybe some lettuce for fresh salads. She'd spent hours researching the best way to transplant the roses, planning to relocate them to the front yard where they could be admired from the street. The work had been harder than expected. The rose bushes were ancient, their root systems deep and tangled. Sarah had rented a small excavator for the larger specimens, but she'd wanted to dig up the smaller ones by hand to preserve their delicate feeder roots. That's when her shovel hit the bag. At first, she thought it was just debris, maybe an old fertilizer sack or garden waste that had been buried and forgotten. But as she cleared away more soil, working carefully around what felt like a substantial object, the faded blue canvas revealed itself. Official, government-issued, and stamped with letters that made her hands shake. USPOSTALSERVICE. The bag was heavy, waterlogged despite being sealed. Sarah's heart hammered as she pulled it free from the earth, dirt cascading from its corners like a macabre hourglass. A brass lock held it closed, corroded green with age but still intact. She knew she should call the police immediately. Instead, she found herself walking to her garage, retrieving a pair of bolt cutters from the toolbox her ex-husband had left behind. The lock snapped easily. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic that had somehow preserved them through 3 decades underground, were hundreds of pieces of mail. Letters, bills, packages, postcards, all dating from September and October 1989, all addressed to residents of Maple Street in the surrounding neighborhood. Sarah's hands trembled as she sorted through the contents. Birthday cards that had never been delivered. Electric bills that had never been paid. Love letters that had never been read. Each piece represented a small tragedy, a moment of connection that had been stolen and buried. But it was the notebook at the bottom that made Sarah's blood run cold. Eddie Morrison's handwriting was neat, methodical, the kind of penmanship they'd taught in schools before computers took over. Entry after entry detailed his daily route, the weather, conversations with residents, normal stuff. The mundane observations of a man who took pride in his work and knew his community intimately. September 15, 1989. Mrs. Henderson's roses looking particularly fine this year. She asked me about the best time to fertilize for winter. Told her October, but she seemed to already know. September 22nd. Strange mix-up with the Kowalski mail today. Mrs. Henderson said they'd asked her to collect it while they were away, but I could have sworn I saw Frank in the Kit Johnson window this morning. October 1st, Mrs. Henderson mentioned the Kowalskis again. Says they're planning to move to Florida soon? Funny, Frank never mentioned it when I saw him last week. The entries continued, growing increasingly concerned, until October 15th, 1989. Mrs. Henderson acting strange again, keeps watching me from her window, asked me not to deliver mail to 1251 today, said the Kowalskis weren't home, but I saw movement in the Kit Johnson this morning. Something's not right. October 16th. Found a letter addressed to me in Mrs. Henderson's outgoing mail. No return address. Just said stop looking or join them. Don't understand what she means. Thinking about calling Deputy Fuller, but he's Mrs. Henderson's nephew. Not sure who to trust. October 17th. Kowalski's mail has been piling up for a week. Mrs. Henderson insists they're visiting family, but their car is still in the driveway. Tried calling the police, but Deputy Fuller said I was overreacting. He's Mrs. Henderson's nephew. Starting to think there's something bigger going on here. October 18th. Mrs. Henderson invited me in for coffee. First time in 15 years. Says she has something important to show me about the Kowalskis. Meeting her after my route. Hope I'm wrong about all this. That was the last entry. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the notebook. The Kowalskis. She'd never heard that name from any of the neighbors who'd shared the Eddie Morrison story. She pulled out her phone and started Googling, her fingers clumsy on the screen. Before we continue with Sarah's investigation, I want to remind you that stories like this take hours of research and preparation. If you're finding this content valuable, please consider supporting the channel by liking this video and sharing it with friends who love true crime mysteries. Your engagement helps me bring you more content like this. The search results made her stomach drop. Frank and Maria Kowalski, ages 67 and 63, reported missing in November 1989. Last seen at their home on Maple Street. The case had gone cold within 6 months, the family assuming they'd simply decided to move away without telling anyone. Their house, 1251 Maple Street, had been sold by the bank in 1992 for unpaid taxes. Sarah looked across her backyard toward the house next door, 1251 Maple Street, where the Kowalskis had lived, where Mrs. Patterson lived now, the sweet old lady who'd brought her cookies and warned her about the ghost of Eddie Morrison. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been Ethel Henderson's niece, who'd inherited the house when Ethel died, who'd insisted on helping Sarah with the landscaping project, then mysteriously canceled when Sarah said she wanted to dig up the rose garden. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was impossible to believe. Sarah found herself walking to her front window, peering through the curtains at Mrs. Patterson's house. The woman was in her garden, deadheading mums with surgical precision, her movements economical and practiced. As if sensing Sarah's gaze, Mrs. Patterson looked up and waved, her smile bright and grandmotherly. Sarah waved back, fighting the urge to run back inside and lock all her doors. She needed more proof. The notebook was compelling, but it was just Eddie's suspicions. She needed to know what had really happened to the Kowalskis and to Eddie. That evening, Sarah drove to the county library, a beautiful Carnegie building that had served the community for over a century. The librarian, a man in his 70s with kind eyes and patient hands, helped her navigate the microfilm machine. Looking up the Morrison case, he asked, threading the film with practiced ease. You're not the first. True crime podcasters come through here every few years, convinced they can solve it. Usually leave disappointed. Did you know Eddie? Oh, sure. Delivered mail to my house for years. Good man, reliable as clockwork. If Eddie Morrison said something was wrong, it was wrong. He lowered his voice and glanced around the empty library. Never believed he just ran off like some folks claimed. Eddie had roots here. His whole family buried in Oakwood Cemetery. His wife, his kids, his grandkids. He wouldn't have left them. The newspaper archives painted a clearer but more disturbing picture. Eddie Morrison, 43, married father of two, had disappeared on October 18, 1989. His mail truck was found parked on Elm Street, 3 blocks from his usual route. The driver's side door was open, keys still in the ignition. The back door was ajar, and several pieces of mail were scattered on the ground as if he'd been interrupted mid-delivery. The investigation had focused initially on the possibility of robbery, but nothing was missing from the truck. Eddie's wallet was still in his jacket pocket, containing $43 and his driver's license. His wedding ring was still on his finger. The mail sorting area was undisturbed. Sarah's blood chilled as she read through the witness statements. Ethel Henderson's was brief but telling. Eddie seemed distracted lately. Asked me strange questions about my neighbors. I told him the Kowalskis had gone to visit their daughter in Florida. That's all I know. But according to the follow-up article, the Kowalskis' daughter in Tampa had told police she hadn't heard from her parents in months. She'd been trying to reach them for weeks, growing increasingly worried about their silence. The investigation had stalled when Deputy Fuller Ethel's nephew, as Eddie had noted, reported that several residents had complained about Eddie's increasingly erratic behavior. The theory became that Eddie had suffered some kind of breakdown and wandered off into the surrounding woods to die. Sarah scrolled through more articles, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. The Kowalskis' missing persons report, filed by their daughter after she'd driven up from Florida to find their house empty. The bank's foreclosure notice for their house, citing unpaid mortgage and tax bills. And finally, a small item from 1995, Ethel Henderson of Maple Street wins 6th consecutive county garden prize for her spectacular rose garden. 6 years after Eddie Morrison disappeared. 6 years after the Kowalskis vanished. Ethel Henderson was winning prizes for roses that may have been fertilized with their bodies. Sarah's head spun. This was insane. She was connecting dots that probably didn't connect, seeing patterns that didn't exist. But Eddie's notebook was real. The buried mailbag was real, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidence. She printed out everything she could find, filling a manila folder with photocopies and notes. As she left the library, the elderly librarian called out to her, "Miss, if you're really looking into this case, you might want to talk to Bobby Henderson. He's Ethel's great-nephew, works at the hardware store on Main Street. He might know things the rest of us don't." Bobby Henderson turned out to be a man in his 50s with calloused hands and a wary expression. When Sarah mentioned she was investigating the Eddie Morrison case, his face went carefully blank. "That's old news," he said, pretending to organize paint cans. "Family doesn't like to talk about it. But you knew your great-aunt well?" "Well enough." He glanced around the empty store, then leaned closer. "Look, Aunt Ethel was difficult, paranoid, thought everyone was out to get her. After Uncle Harold died, she got worse, started seeing threats everywhere." "What kind of threats?" Bobby was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. She thought people were stealing from her, mail, money, even her garden tools. She started keeping track of everything, writing it all down in these little notebooks. When she died, we found dozens of them. What happened to the notebooks? Cousin Patricia, Mrs. Patterson, she took them. Said they were family business. Bobby's expression darkened. "But I read some of them before she took them away. Aunt Ethel, she wrote about people who weren't around anymore. talked about them like they were still there, still causing problems. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. What do you mean? She wrote about the Kowalskis for years after they disappeared. About Eddie Morrison, too. Like they were still living on the street, still bothering her. It wasn't normal. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about Ethel Henderson's notebooks, about the scattered mail, about the roses that had grown so magnificently in soil that might have been enriched with human remains. She needed to see Mrs. Patterson's backyard. The next morning, Sarah knocked on her neighbor's door, rehearsing her approach. Mrs. Patterson opened it with a bright smile, flour dusting her floral apron. Sarah, dear, perfect timing. I just pulled a coffee cake from the oven. Would you like some? Actually, I was wondering if I could see your garden. I'm thinking about planting some roses, and everyone says you have the most beautiful ones on the street. Mrs. Patterson's smile flickered, just for a moment. So briefly, Sarah almost missed it. Oh, I'm afraid they're not at their best right now. End of season, you know. Most of the blooms have faded. I don't mind. I'd love to see where you plant them, get an idea of the layout. Well, Mrs. Patterson glanced back into her house, then stepped outside, closing the door firmly behind her. I suppose a quick look wouldn't hurt, but I'm afraid I can't offer you any cuttings. Aunt Ethel always said these varieties were too delicate to transplant. She led Sarah around to the backyard, chattering about soil composition and fertilizer schedules. But Sarah wasn't listening. She was scanning the yard looking for disturbed earth, unusual growth patterns, anything that might indicate where bodies were buried. The backyard was larger than it appeared from the street, stretching back toward a line of mature oak trees. The roses were indeed past their prime, but they were massive, bigger than the ones in Sarah's yard had been, older, and they grew in strange clusters, as if marking specific spots rather than following any decorative pattern. Your aunt certainly had a gift, Sarah said carefully. Oh yes. Aunt Ethel always said the secret was in the soil preparation. She spent hours working in this garden, especially after the neighborhood troubles. Troubles? Mrs. Patterson's eyes sharpened slightly. You know, when people started disappearing, Eddie Morrison, the Kowalskis, Aunt Ethel was always worried about strangers in the neighborhood after that. She took security very seriously. The way she said strangers made Sarah's skin crawl. As if Eddie Morrison, who'd walked this route for 15 years, was somehow an outsider threatening the community. The Kowalskis lived right here, didn't they? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Yes, but they moved away, suddenly. Didn't even say goodbye. Mrs. Patterson's voice had taken on a rehearsed quality, as if she'd told this story many times. Aunt Ethel was heartbroken. They'd been such good neighbors. Sarah nodded, but her eyes were fixed on a particular cluster of roses near the back of the garden. 3 bushes, planted in a rough triangular pattern, each one massive, their roots clearly well established. Perfect markers for 3 graves. The soil around them was different, too darker, richer than the rest of the garden. And there were no other plants nearby, as if Mrs. Patterson was careful not to disturb that particular area. Mrs. Patterson, Sarah said slowly, did your aunt ever mention finding anything unusual in her garden when she was planting? The older woman went very still. What kind of thing? Oh, you know, old bottles, coins, artifacts. Sometimes when you dig deep, you find interesting things. Aunt Ethel was very thorough in her gardening. If she found anything, she would have disposed of it properly. Mrs. Patterson's voice had gone flat, emotionless. She believed in keeping the past buried. The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Sarah felt every instinct screaming at her to leave, to run, to get as far away from this sweet old lady as possible. Instead, she smiled. Well, thank you for showing me around. I should get back to my own gardening. Yes, Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. You should. As Sarah walked back to her own yard, she could feel Mrs. Patterson watching her from the Kit Johnson window. The sensation of being observed followed her into her house, making her check and double-check the locks on her doors. That evening, she called the police. Not the local department. She learned enough about Deputy Fuller and the Henderson family connections to know the corruption might run deeper than one man. She called the state police. Detective Maria Santos was a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She listened to Sarah's story without interruption, taking notes in a small leather notebook that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of Eddie Morrison's journal. "This is quite a theory," Detective Santos said when Sarah finished. "You realize we'd need substantial evidence to get a search warrant for Mrs. Patterson's property? I have Eddie's notebook. I have the stolen mail. I have 34 years of unanswered questions. You have the suspicions of a missing man and a bag of old mail that could have been buried for any number of reasons." The detective's tone wasn't unkind, but it was realistic. Defense attorneys would tear this apart. "But you'll investigate?" Detective Santos studied the notebook again, reading Eddie's increasingly desperate entries. "I'll make some calls. See what I can find out about the original investigation. But I want you to understand, if we're wrong about this, we'll destroy an elderly woman's life. And if we're right, we'll finally give three families some answers." The detective nodded slowly. "Let me do some background work. I'll be in touch." Over the next few days, Sarah found herself jumping at every sound, checking her locks obsessively, peering through her curtains at Mrs. Patterson's house. The old woman continued her daily routine, tending her garden, collecting her mail, waving cheerfully when their paths crossed, but there was something different about her now, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. Detective Santos called on Thursday afternoon. "I've been reviewing the original case files," she said. "There are some inconsistencies I'd like to explore. Can you meet me at the station tomorrow morning?" The state police barracks was a modern building 20 miles from Maple Street. Detective Santos led Sarah to a small conference room where files and photographs were spread across a large table. "Tell me again about finding the mailbag," the detective said. Sarah walked through the discovery step by step, answering detailed questions about the exact location, the condition of the bag, the contents. "And you're certain this came from your property, not Mrs. Patterson's?" "Positive. I was digging up rose bushes that had clearly been planted in my yard for decades. The bag was buried directly beneath one of them." Detective Santos nodded and pulled out a folder. "I've been looking into Ethel Henderson's background. Did you know she was arrested for mail theft in 1987? Sarah's eyes widened. "Number. What happened?" "Charges were dropped. Insufficient evidence, and the complainant, an elderly man named Wilson, died before the case went to trial. But there were accusations that she was intercepting Social Security checks and pension payments. Just like Eddie suspected. It gets more interesting. After Eddie Morrison disappeared, there were several reports of missing mail in the neighborhood, but they all got routed through Deputy Fuller, and somehow they all got dismissed as Postal Service errors." Detective Santos showed Sarah a map of Maple Street from 1989. Red dots marked the houses where missing mail had been reported. "Look at the pattern," the detective said. "Every red dot was within a 3-block radius of Ethel Henderson's house. And at the center of it all, the Kowalski house sat empty, while their mail continued to be delivered to an address that didn't want it." "I think we have enough for a search warrant," Detective Santos said. Detective Santos arrived the next morning with a search warrant and a team of forensic investigators. Sarah met them at her fence line, Eddie Morrison's notebook clutched in her hands like a talisman. "You realize this could all be nothing," Detective Santos warned as the team unloaded their equipment. 34-year-old suspicions of a missing man don't always lead to evidence." "I know," Sarah said, watching Mrs. Patterson emerge from her house. The elderly woman stood on her front porch, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with undisguised hostility. "But look at the pattern. 3 people disappear. The one person who connects them all wins garden prizes for the next 30 years. And now I find the missing mailman's bag buried in what used to be her aunt's garden." Detective Santos studied the notebook one more time, then looked across the yard at Mrs. Patterson's house. "We'll start with ground-penetrating radar. If we find anomalies consistent with buried remains, we'll excavate. But I want you to understand, if we're wrong, this will destroy that woman's reputation and probably her health. And if we're right? If we're right, we're about to solve one of the longest-running missing persons cases in state history." The radar equipment arrived that afternoon, a cart-mounted device that looked like a small lawnmower with a computer screen attached. Sarah watched from her window as technicians swept Mrs. Patterson's backyard in careful grids, their movements methodical and precise. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told the story. Initial sweeps showing nothing unusual. Then excited pointing as they focused on the area near the 3 rose bushes. Urgent radio calls. More equipment arriving. Mrs. Patterson remained on her porch, no longer pretending to tend her flowers. She sat in a rocking chair, watching the investigation with the stillness of someone who had been expecting this day for a very long time. By evening, the first grave had been located. "We've got 3 distinct anomalies," Detective Santos told Sarah, "all approximately 6 feet in length, buried at different depths. We'll start excavating tomorrow morning." The excavation took 3 days. Sarah couldn't bring herself to watch the actual digging, but she could hear the machinery in the morning, giving way to the careful scraping of tools and brushes as the day progressed. The crime scene tape fluttered in the October wind like prayer flags marking a sacred site. News vans began arriving on the second day. Sarah found herself trapped in her own house, unable to leave without facing cameras and shouted questions. The story had broken nationally. Mailman's 34-year-old mystery solved by new homeowner. On the third day, Detective Santos knocked on her door. "We found them," she said simply, "all 3. Eddie Morrison had been buried deepest, wrapped in canvas mail bags like a makeshift shroud. The forensic anthropologist estimated he'd been dead for approximately 34 years, consistent with his disappearance date. The Kowalskis were in a shallower grave, their remains intermingled as if they'd been buried together in the same hole. "How did they die?" Sarah whispered. "Blunt force trauma to the skull. All 3 victims. Multiple strikes with a heavy implement. We found the weapon too, a gardening spade, buried with the Kowalskis. The blood residue and bone fragments match all 3 victims. And Ethel Henderson? Her fingerprints are still on the handle. After 34 years underground, we got a perfect match." Mrs. Patterson was arrested that evening as she sat in her rocking chair, still watching the crime scene. She didn't resist, didn't deny the charges. She simply nodded when Detective Santos read her rights, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. At the station, she asked for a cup of tea and began to talk. "Eddie wouldn't leave it alone," she said, her voice steady but tired. "Aunt Ethel tried to warn him, but he kept asking questions about Frank and Maria. She told him they'd moved to Florida, but he wouldn't accept it." The story came out in careful, precise sentences. Mrs. Patterson had known the truth for years, ever since she'd found her aunt's detailed journals while cleaning out the house after Ethel's death. Frank Kowalski had discovered Ethel Henderson stealing mail in September of 1989. Not just misdelivering it, actually opening envelopes, removing checks, and depositing them in accounts she'd set up using false identities. When Frank confronted her in her garden one evening, demanding she stop and threatening to call the police, Ethel had struck him with her gardening spade. "It was supposed to be self-defense," Mrs. Patterson said. "That's what Aunt Ethel wrote in her journal." Frank was shouting at her, threatening her. She just wanted him to stop. But Frank's wife, Maria, had witnessed the attack from her Kit Johnson window. She'd run outside, screaming, calling for help. Ethel had struck her too, multiple times until she stopped moving. Aunt Ethel dragged them both into her garden and buried them that same night, Mrs. Patterson continued. She planted the roses over their graves, said it was fitting they'd help something beautiful grow. Eddie Morrison's death had been different, premeditated. When he'd come to the house on October 18th, asking pointed questions about the Kowalskis' whereabouts, Ethel had been ready. She'd invited him in for coffee, drugged it with sleeping pills, and killed him while he was unconscious. "She told me she felt bad about Eddie," Mrs. Patterson said. "He was just doing his job, but she couldn't let him expose what she'd done. She had to protect the family name." Detective Santos leaned forward. "And you knew about this when you inherited the house?" "Not at first. I found the journals later, hidden in a safety deposit box. There were detailed maps of the garden, instructions for caring for the graves. Aunt Ethel called it tending the memories. The buried mail had been part of a larger scheme. Ethel Henderson had been intercepting and stealing mail for years, focusing on checks and money orders from elderly residents who might not immediately notice the theft. The Social Security Administration estimated she'd stolen over $50,000 over the course of a decade. She was desperate, Mrs. Patterson explained. Uncle Harold's medical bills had wiped out their savings. The house was mortgaged. She saw an opportunity and took it. And after you discovered the truth, you helped cover it up, Detective Santos said. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. She made me promise, said the dead were at peace, and disturbing them would only cause pain for everyone else. I kept the roses healthy, deflected questions about the old mysteries. I thought, I thought it was better to let sleeping dogs lie, until Sarah started digging in her garden. I tried to discourage her, offered to help her plant vegetables in the front yard instead. But when she found Eddie's mailbag, Mrs. Patterson shrugged. I knew it was over. As Sarah watched her neighbor being led away in handcuffs, she thought about the roses. How beautiful they'd been. How proud Ethel Henderson had been of her garden. How the neighbors had admired her dedication to keeping the past alive in the most literal way possible. The roses would have to be destroyed now, of course. The entire backyard was a crime scene, every inch of soil potentially containing evidence. But Sarah found herself wondering if she would have made the same choice Ethel Henderson had, if she'd been desperate enough, if she'd been scared enough. The answer frightened her more than the murders themselves. Detective Santos stopped by a week later, after the media attention had begun to die down and the crime scene tape had been removed. Mrs. Patterson's house stood empty, a for sale sign already planted in the front yard. The Postal Service wants to thank you officially, Detective Santos said. Eddie Morrison's family never stopped believing he'd been murdered. His son is driving up from Dallas next week to see where we found him. Sarah nodded. What about the stolen mail? Can any of it still be delivered? After 34 years? Most of it's irrelevant now. Birthday cards for people who are dead, bills for accounts that have been closed for decades. But there were a few interesting pieces. Detective Santos pulled out an evidence bag. This was addressed to the previous owner of your house. Inside was a postcard from Hawaii, the colors faded but still vibrant. The front showed a sunset over the Pacific Ocean, the kind of image that made you want to book a flight immediately. The back was addressed to Ethel Henderson, 1247 Maple Street, and signed Having a Wonderful Time. Love, Frank and Maria. The postmark was October 17, 1989, the day before Eddie Morrison disappeared. They were sending her a postcard? Sarah said, confused. Detective Santos shook her head. Look at the address more carefully. Sarah studied the postcard again. The handwriting was in two distinct styles. The street number 1247 was written in Frank Kowalski's neat script, matching samples from his personal papers. But Maple Street was written in Ethel Henderson's more elaborate handwriting. She changed the address, Sarah realized. She intercepted their mail and redirected it to her own house. Even their vacation postcards. Ethel Henderson wasn't just stealing their money, she was stealing their entire correspondence. She'd been isolating them from the outside world for months, maybe years. When they finally figured out what she was doing, Detective Santos didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear and horrifying. Sarah kept the postcard after the case was closed. She wasn't sure why, but it seemed important to preserve this one piece of evidence that Frank and Maria Kowalski had been happy once, that they'd traveled together, seen beautiful sunsets, thought fondly of home even while their neighbor was plotting their deaths. She planted new roses in her backyard the following spring, different varieties than Ethel Henderson's prize winners. These ones were smaller, more delicate, requiring less elaborate soil preparation. They grew in neat rows rather than mysterious clusters, and Sarah found their orderly appearance comforting. The vegetable garden she'd originally planned never materialized. Somehow, the idea of growing food in soil that had once concealed bodies seemed wrong, even after the forensic team had cleared the area. Sometimes on quiet October mornings when the mist rose from the dew-covered grass, Sarah thought she could hear Eddie Morrison's footsteps on the sidewalk, the steady rhythm of a mailman who'd never finished his route, who died trying to protect his neighbors from a predator they'd never suspected. But when she looked outside, the street was always empty, except for the new mail carrier, a young woman who drove a modern truck and delivered packages with cheerful efficiency. The roses, at least, were growing beautifully, and beneath them, the soil held only the promise of spring blooms, not the secrets of the dead. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey into one of the most disturbing cases I've ever covered. The Henderson case shows us that evil can hide behind the most innocent facades, and that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the darkest secrets. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more true crime content and let me know in the comments what case you'd like me to investigate next. Until then, stay safe out there.